it is likely that you are not doing enough deep planning to make sure that you have a successful retirement. And what I mean by that is that most people really only scratch the surface and they run too simple of a retirement analysis to determine if they've saved enough and if they will be able to support their dreams and goals in retirement. Imagine what would happen if you retired from your great paying job that had great benefits and you're excited to enter in that new phase of life where you've saved up all these wonderful trips and experiences, only to find out that you have a tight budget because you didn't adequately account for things like inflation or common expenses that pop up in retirement. I'm Amber Knips, wealth advisor at Sweet Financial Partners, located in Fairmont and Jackson, Minnesota. And I specialize in working with high net worth individuals who are looking at retirement and big life changes because we believe everyone has the right to realize that their dreams are possible. And we use that as a focus when working with clients and helping them plan for their future. I can think of this client who has a great analytical brain. He put together this really detailed spreadsheet and was feeling really comfortable about the assumptions and everything that he had used for retirement. And as we sat down and built the full plan, because he was like, well, maybe it is time to tag in a little bit extra expertise as we go through things. And he was really surprised of how different our numbers came out. And, in looking at that, there were so many things that he didn't account for. He had done a great job of putting together income and what current expenses are, but he didn't take into account a lot of the other big things that we often see pop up. So we help people retire every day, and retirement is new for you. So it's not something that you've done before. So it's so important to consider all of the different things and make sure you're taking into account the things that you don't know, because you don't know what you don't know, and that's why we're here to help. So what I want to focus on today are the 6 key questions that you need to be asking yourself as you begin to enter the retirement planning phase. And the sooner that you can ask these questions, the better, and really start thinking about that. Because oftentimes I see people planning too late for retirement either, where maybe they lose some different opportunities that they potentially had before. So the first and maybe one of the most important is, how long will your money last? And this is probably a question that you've been having or one that you've been trying to calculate. And from a simple math perspective, given a specific interest rate, a starting principal amount, a fixed monthly amount, you can maybe estimate what you think it would take for your balance to drop to zero. And like I'd mentioned before about that client I sat down with, a lot of people walk into our office with an Excel spreadsheet where they projected all of those different numbers with the help of interest rates. And although it's a great starting point and it helps to really get the conversation started, it's not enough to build your overall retirement plan. You can never know with full certainty how interest rates will fluctuate or really how long you are expected to live, which is even more clear with what we've been seeing with interest rates in the past year. So answering the question of how long your money will last is such a much deeper conversation, and a lot of important factors need to be taken into account to be realistic and uncover all those different bases. So we believe it's important to run different stress tests to see how different market events and different things overall that happen will affect your long-term success. So we know it's not realistic to say you're going to get an average return of X growth rate every year. So running those different stress tests says some years are really great and some years are not so great. So trying to make it as realistic as possible, as well as taking into account worst case scenario. Because what we want to do is try and eliminate the amount of surprises, because on the scheme of surprises, those kind of maybe hit more towards the bottom. So the next consideration being, how long will you spend in retirement? And this is just another way of saying, how long do you expect to live? And unfortunately, there's no magic formula that tells us exactly what that looks like. And maybe we don't want to know anyways. I don't know if I do. There are tools to help you calculate your estimated life expectancy according to how old you are, your gender, all of those different things. But bear in mind, those don't take into account your specific lifestyle and your health factors. So we like to use a little bit longer of a life expectancy when we're doing our planning, just so when you see, everything that's going through your plan, we're looking at more of a worst case scenario from a financial standpoint because your assets need to last a really long time. So a few things we take into consideration is passing away too soon. What could that look like if your money remained unspent? It's important to think of, well, what do you want to happen with that money? Or what would happen with your surviving spouse or your surviving children? Would they have adequate money if something happened to you too soon? And another piece of this too is taking into account any survivorship options, things on Social Security, or if you have a pension. That's a really important piece to have in the conversation that oftentimes I see people just checking the box and making the decision, and then you can't go back. As well as living longer than expected. So if you live longer than expected, you might run the risk of running out of money. So we try and run those different longevity pieces to say, what could potentially happen? Let's make the best financial decisions that we can, knowing we can't control our expiration date, but we can control our understanding of what happens at each of those different ages and see if there's any holes. So the next question to ask yourself is, what is the gap between income and expenses? And this is one that I often find clients don't have a clear picture of, while we're working. Because from a simple standpoint, you spend what you make, right? You might save here and there, but overall, you don't maybe need to be super careful about those different numbers. So a great place to start when you're thinking about, exactly what expenses look like is say, well, what's your current net income? So what's the amount that gets deposited in your bank account each pay period? And then look at the end of the month and say, well, was my bank account balance higher or was it lower? And that can get you an idea. If it's higher than it was before, you didn't spend everything that you made. If it's lower, then maybe you're spending even a little bit more than you're making every month. And you need to take a closer peek at some of those maybe one-off expenses that pop up. It may take a couple of months, but making a list of all of those current expenses, both fixed and variable, will get you the most accurate starting point. And it can be really insightful to look at, how that sits right now, and then sit down with your advisor and say, well, what could potentially change in retirement? What of those numbers do we often see changing? Because that's something we see a lot of trends on. And really when working with clients, what I often find is that overspending isn't necessarily an issue, but maybe underspending is an issue. And it's kind of an interesting conversation because it's shifting the mindset that's been burned into our minds for 30 years. We need to save as much as possible. We don't need, to tap into our reserves, as try and build up as much as possible. Well, now retirement's a whole new ballgame. Now we're like, let's spend, let's do and enjoy some of those things. And that can be really hard. So, working through the planning, it's just as much of a conversation of maybe giving yourself permission to spend, and going through those numbers can help work through that. So figuring out what the gap is between income and expenses is a really crucial number, especially when we look at the next big question, which is, what's your withdrawal strategy? I cannot count how many times I've been asked, well, how much can I withdraw every month, every year without running out of money? And you may have heard of the 4% general rule of thumb, which is a great starting place to get a rough idea. But taking a fixed amount from your account every year might not be the best strategy either. As time passes, you will need to account for inflation. Otherwise, maybe you're not doing some of the things that are important to you. So in addition to the longevity uncertainty, your attitude towards, different things might be uncertain too. Maybe it's, well, I might not make it that long. I should live more now and spend more now. Or I'd hate to run out of money. Maybe I shouldn't spend quite as much. So it's a really hard kind of in between to find, but it can be found by going through some of that planning. And, in regards to expenses, I often have people say, well, I'll spend a lot less in my later years of retirement, right? So I could do more now. And, oftentimes the older we get, the less travel that we want to do. It becomes a little bit more work, a little bit more daunting. But We're often seeing the expenses that you spent traveling is maybe now shifted a little bit. So still spending that, but it's going somewhere different, maybe for healthcare expenses or long-term care costs or gifting to family. And that becomes a priority that maybe wasn't as much when you were a little bit younger. So, based on the different factors, it's really prudent to look at adjusting your spending rate during different phases of retirement and not just using a set it and forget it, because that might not fare well over time. And especially when you look at the difference of being tax efficient and what that can make. I've had so many new clients come in and say, well, here's where I'm taking my withdrawals. And then we sit down and we go through some of that deeper tax planning, that they were maybe missing before. And when you look at the amounts coming out of each account, can potentially make a big difference by making just some changes of a little bit from each to try and keep in certain tax brackets and different things like that. So if you're not looking at the tax piece of things, you're possibly making some big mistakes. And, in that, with those tax considerations, those mistakes can make a big deal for you now and potentially for your heirs down the road. So if you have intentions of leaving money to the kids or grandkids, that would be something that you should be asking yourself and saying, is it important to leave a legacy? And if you haven't thought about it, think about what leaving a legacy means to you, because there's two different parts to this. So the first, of course, is the monetary piece. We hear it all the time. I want to leave as much money to the kids as possible, or I want each kid to get X amount of money. And then I start asking more questions about, well, what does that look like? Is there a certain dollar amount? Is there a specific purpose that you want them to use those funds for? And does it need to be investments, or could it be other pieces of things like property? And after rattling off all those questions, I often get kind of that deer in headlights, like, oh my gosh, I don't know. I hadn't thought about it. And we all want to continue to take care of our kids. We never stop being moms. We never stop being dads, which is perfectly okay. But it's important to think about some of those goals so that if they are important to you, you're making sure you're accounting for that, as well as making sure that your goals still get met too, and you get to do what's important to you. And this could prompt a conversation in regards to current spending and saying, well, will you spend down too much of your potential plan? So maybe you're not going to meet that goal if it's really important of leaving a financial legacy. And maybe that means it's time to look at life insurance or reallocating some of the insurance that you currently have. And the second piece of leaving a legacy that's often not thought about is, what do you want to be remembered for? Or what do you want to pass on to the next generation? I had a family meeting recently where the dad had passed away and he'd been sick for a while, and he had everything put in place, which was such a blessing for his kids. His 4 kids came in, and usually the purpose of the meeting is we go through, who's listed as beneficiary, what types of accounts they're going to inherit, what's the tax impact, and all those different things. But this meeting was different. We went through all of that, which is important, but the majority of the meeting was being talked about the impact that he made on them and who they are now. So for them, the money piece wasn't as important, but the most valuable piece was what they were inheriting from him in lessons and some of those different things. So I think oftentimes we maybe get caught up on the money piece, but that might not be the most important to your family as well. So, which is exactly why we want to think about, as a parent, what is it that you want to leave a lasting impression? And taking that a step further and saying, is there anything that you should be doing or could be doing differently? And the final important consideration is your current plan sustainable? So here you tie all of those different things we talked about now together and say, what does that look like? And this is where working with an advisor is crucial, to make sure that all of the assumptions that you're working through are as accurate and realistic. As I mentioned, I've seen so many circumstances where we've seen big gaping holes in plans, and it's at the point where it's too late to make any big changes, and it might mean a lifestyle change. And that's something that we really want to avoid. So it's so important to think of some of those what ifs that could derail your plan, and really stress testing to help reduce the chances of surprises, not good surprises later on. So while you're on a roll of thinking about how to ease into a successful retirement, you need to check out my other video where I talk about avoiding common retirement mistake. So this is where I go into more detail on the tax piece and considerations with that, which I think is incredibly important, especially in the earlier planning phases as well.